Ladies and gentlemen, imagine for a moment that we are stepping into a time machine, traveling back exactly 100 years to the year 1924. Canada, as we know it today, was still in its formative years, growing, evolving, and adapting to the changing world around it. The Roaring Twenties were in full swing, a decade known for its progress, optimism, and transformation. Yet at the same time, it was also a period marked by struggles, inequality, and hardship for many. The echoes of World War I were still fresh in the minds of Canadians. The war had ended just 6 years earlier, in 1918, leaving behind a nation that was both proud of its contributions and deeply affected by the sacrifices made. Tens of thousands of Canadian soldiers had lost their lives, and many who returned home struggled to reintegrate into society. Veterans faced difficulties finding work, and many suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD, though at the time, it was often dismissed as shell shock, with little understanding or support. Despite these challenges, Canada was experiencing a period of economic growth and modernization. New industries were emerging, cities were expanding, and technological advancements were beginning to reshape everyday life. There was a sense of excitement in the air. People were beginning to embrace automobiles, radios, and even the early stages of commercial aviation. At the same time, many still clung to the old ways, living in rural communities where life revolved around farming, hard labor, and close-knit family values. But Canada in 1924 was also a land of contrast. It was a time of opportunity for some, yet great struggle for others. Immigration was reshaping the country's cultural landscape, bringing in new ideas and traditions, but it also led to discrimination and exclusionary policies. Women had won the right to vote in most provinces, yet their roles in society remained largely confined to the home. Indigenous peoples faced oppressive government policies, including the devastating impacts of the residential school system, which sought to erase their culture and identity. This was Canada in 1924, a country on the brink of change, full of hopes and dreams, yet still grappling with the inequalities of the past. Over the next few minutes, we will journey deeper into this world, exploring what life was really like for Canadians a century ago. From the bustling city streets to the quiet rural farmlands, from the excitement of new inventions to the struggles of those left behind, we will uncover the reality of a nation in transition. In 1924, Canada was a country still finding its identity, a land of vast wilderness, growing cities, and tight-knit rural communities. The population had reached approximately 9 million people, a fraction of today's numbers, yet the country was expanding rapidly. Most Canadians still lived in small towns and villages, where life revolved around agriculture, local businesses, and strong community ties. Cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver were growing, but urban life was far from what we recognize today. The majority of the population was of British or French descent, a legacy of Canada's colonial past. English and French were the dominant languages, and tensions between these two communities sometimes shaped national policies and cultural divides. Quebec, in particular, remained distinct in its traditions and way of life, with a society deeply rooted in Catholic values and rural customs. Meanwhile, in the western provinces, large pockets of German, Ukrainian, and Scandinavian immigrants had settled, creating unique cultural enclaves that still exist today. Despite this diversity, Canada in 1924 was not always welcoming to newcomers. Immigration policies favored white Europeans, particularly those from Britain and Western Europe, while many Asian and Eastern European immigrants faced discrimination and barriers to citizenship. The Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, also known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, had been passed just a year earlier, effectively banning Chinese immigration to Canada. This reflected a broader sentiment of racial and cultural exclusion, one that would persist for decades before reforms in the mid-20th century. Daily life in Canada was simple by modern standards, but it required hard work and resilience. In rural areas, families relied on farming, logging, and mining to make a living. Farming communities were the backbone of the economy, with families working long hours to cultivate crops, tend livestock, and survive the harsh winters. Homes were modest, often without electricity or running water, and survival depended on the collective efforts of every family member. In contrast, life in the cities was more fast-paced, though still challenging. Factories, textile mills, and steel plants provided jobs for thousands of workers, but conditions were often harsh. Long hours, low wages, and minimal labor rights made factory work difficult, particularly for women and children, who were still part of the workforce in some industries. Social class also played a significant role in Canadian society at this time. The wealthy lived in grand homes, enjoyed fine dining, and had access to education and leisure activities that were out of reach for the working class. The middle class was beginning to grow, thanks to the expansion of white-collar jobs, but for many, life was a daily struggle to make ends meet. For Indigenous communities, life in 1924 was shaped by government policies that sought to assimilate them into Euro-Canadian society. The residential school system was in full operation, forcibly removing Indigenous children from their families and communities in an attempt to erase their cultural identity. Reserves were under strict government control, and Indigenous people faced severe restrictions on their rights, including limited mobility and barriers to land ownership. Despite the hardships and inequalities of the time, there was also a strong sense of resilience and hope among the people of Canada. Communities came together to support one another, and the bonds of family and tradition remained strong. As the country continued to grow, so too did the dreams of those who called it home. The story of Canada in 1924 is one of a young nation on the move, rooted in old traditions, yet beginning to embrace new ideas and opportunities. From small farming villages to bustling city streets, from tight-knit immigrant communities to the struggles of Indigenous peoples, the social fabric of the country was complex and ever-changing. In 1924, Canada was in the midst of an immigration boom, a period of significant demographic change that would shape the nation's identity for generations to come. The country had long relied on immigration to fuel its growth, and the post-World War I years saw a renewed push to attract settlers from Europe. With a vast landscape, abundant natural resources, and an expanding economy, Canada was eager to welcome new workers, farmers, and entrepreneurs who could help build the nation. The Canadian government actively encouraged immigration, particularly from Britain and Western Europe. British immigrants were seen as ideal settlers due to their cultural and linguistic ties to Canada's colonial past. Programs and incentives were designed to make migration from the United Kingdom appealing, offering land grants, employment opportunities, and assistance with travel costs. Many British families arrived seeking a better life, bringing with them their traditions, work ethic, and aspirations for the future. Beyond Britain, large numbers of immigrants were also arriving from other parts of Europe, particularly from Ukraine, Germany, Poland, and Scandinavia. The western provinces, with their vast open lands and growing agricultural sector, became home to many of these newcomers. Ukrainian and German immigrants, in particular, played a crucial role in developing the prairies, turning wild grasslands into productive farmland. They endured harsh winters, primitive living conditions, and the difficulties of building new communities from the ground up, yet their perseverance helped establish strong cultural roots that still exist today. However, not all immigrants were welcomed equally. Canada's immigration policies in the early 20th century were shaped by racial and ethnic biases, with a clear preference for white, Christian Europeans. While British and Western European immigrants were encouraged to settle, those from Eastern Europe, Asia, and other non-Western regions faced significant challenges and discrimination. One of the most striking examples of exclusionary policies was the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, also known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. This law, passed just a year before 1924, effectively banned Chinese immigration to Canada. Chinese laborers had played a vital role in building the Canadian Pacific Railway in the late 19th century, yet they were met with hostility and racism once the work was completed. By the 1920s, anti-Chinese sentiment was strong, and the government enforced policies that severely limited their rights and opportunities. Chinese communities, particularly in cities like Vancouver and Toronto, struggled under these harsh restrictions, facing segregation, employment barriers, and social prejudice. Similarly, immigrants from India and Japan faced severe restrictions. The Continuous Journey Regulation of 1908, which remained in effect in 1924, required that immigrants travel to Canada via a continuous journey from their home country, a near impossible requirement for those from India, as direct voyages from South Asia were not available at the time. This law was designed specifically to keep out Indian immigrants, particularly Sikhs, many of whom had initially come to Canada in the early 1900s seeking work in lumber mills and farms. Jewish immigrants also encountered prejudice, despite many seeking refuge from rising anti-Semitism in Europe. While some Jewish families found opportunities in business and trade, they were often excluded from social institutions, professional organizations, and certain neighborhoods due to widespread discrimination. The experiences of these diverse immigrant communities highlight the complexities of Canada's immigration policies in 1924. While the country promoted itself as a land of opportunity, the reality was that opportunities were not granted equally. Many newcomers had to fight for their place in society, overcoming barriers and prejudices while working tirelessly to build new lives. Despite these challenges, immigration was undeniably shaping Canada's identity. Multicultural communities were beginning to emerge in major cities, adding to the rich tapestry of Canadian culture. European settlers were transforming the landscape, contributing to the agricultural and industrial growth of the nation. Even those who faced discrimination and exclusion found ways to establish themselves, forming strong, resilient communities that would go on to demand greater rights and recognition in the decades to come. The immigration boom of the 1920s set the stage for Canada's future as a diverse and evolving nation. It was a time of both hope and hardship for newcomers, an era when the promise of a better life often came with unexpected struggles, yet one that ultimately laid the foundation for the multicultural society that Canada would become. In 1924, Canada's economy was in a period of transformation. The country was still recovering from the impact of World War I, which had both stimulated industrial growth and left economic instability in its wake. While the post-war years brought some prosperity, they also introduced new challenges, particularly for workers and rural farmers who struggled to keep up with changing economic conditions. At the heart of Canada's economy was agriculture, which remained the dominant industry, especially in the prairie provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Farmers were the backbone of the nation, producing wheat, barley, and other staple crops that were exported to markets around the world. However, farming in the 1920s was far from easy. Unlike today, most farming was done manually or with basic machinery, and farmers were at the mercy of unpredictable weather, fluctuating grain prices, and increasing competition from other countries. Many farm families lived a subsistence lifestyle, growing their own food, raising livestock, and making do with what they had. Long hours in the fields were followed by additional labor at home, with women playing a crucial role in maintaining the household, cooking, sewing, preserving food, and caring for children. For many, financial security was uncertain, and a single bad harvest could mean financial ruin. Rural communities were closely knit, with neighbors relying on each other for support, trade, and shared resources. While farming remained dominant, industrialization was rapidly changing the economic landscape. The rise of manufacturing, mining, and forestry meant that more people were leaving farms for jobs in the cities, seeking better wages and opportunities. Factories in Toronto, Montreal, and Hamilton were producing textiles, steel, automobiles, and consumer goods at a growing pace. However, factory work was grueling, long shifts, low pay, and unsafe conditions were common, and labor rights were still in their infancy. Many workers had little protection against exploitation, and strikes or union activities were often met with resistance from employers and the government. One of the fastest-growing industries in 1924 was mining, particularly in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. Gold, silver, nickel, and copper were in high demand, and mining towns sprang up across the country, attracting workers from all backgrounds. These jobs, however, were dangerous, with little regard for worker safety. Miners faced long hours underground, breathing in dust and working with hazardous equipment, often for minimal wages. Yet, for many, it was the only path to economic stability. The forestry industry was also expanding, particularly in British Columbia, where logging operations provided timber for both domestic use and export. Lumber camps were harsh environments, where men worked long hours cutting trees, hauling logs, and enduring extreme weather conditions. Logging remained one of the most physically demanding jobs, and injuries were common due to the lack of modern safety equipment. In the urban centers, new opportunities were emerging in white-collar professions. The banking, insurance, and retail sectors were growing, and clerical jobs became more common, especially for men seeking stable employment. These office jobs, though not as physically demanding as factory work, often required long hours and strict discipline, with little room for advancement. For women, economic opportunities were still largely limited. While some worked in factories, textile mills, or as domestic servants, most were expected to stay at home, managing household responsibilities and raising children. The idea of women in professional roles was still a rarity, though small changes were beginning to take place. A few women were finding work as teachers, nurses, and secretaries, but they were often paid less than men and faced significant discrimination in the workplace. Meanwhile, Indigenous communities were largely excluded from Canada's growing economy. Government policies restricted their access to land, education, and employment opportunities. Many Indigenous people were confined to reserves, where economic prospects were bleak, and they were discouraged or outright prevented from participating in mainstream industries. Those who did seek work off the reserves often faced severe discrimination and were paid far less than their non-Indigenous counterparts. Despite these challenges, the 1920s were a time of optimism for many Canadians. The economy was growing, and new technologies such as automobiles, electricity, and early aviation were beginning to reshape industries. Entrepreneurs and investors saw opportunities in expanding markets, and cities were bustling with activity. However, the economic inequalities between rural and urban areas, between men and women, and between different racial and ethnic groups remained stark. The year 1924 represented a Canada on the move, one where traditional industries still played a crucial role, but modern economic forces were beginning to reshape the country's future. The tensions between rural and urban life, between old ways and new technologies, and between economic opportunity and inequality would continue to define the nation in the years to come. In 1924, transportation in Canada was undergoing a major transformation. The country was vast, stretching thousands of kilometers from the Atlantic to the Pacific and connecting people, goods, and industries across such a massive landscape was a constant challenge. Railroads had long been the backbone of Canada's transportation network, but new technologies, most notably automobiles and aviation, were beginning to change the way people and businesses moved across the nation. The railroads, Canada's lifeline. For decades, railways had been Canada's primary means of long-distance travel and shipping. The Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR, and Canadian National Railway, CNR, played crucial roles in connecting eastern cities like Montreal and Toronto to western hubs such as Winnipeg, Calgary, and Vancouver. Trains transported not only passengers, but also vast quantities of wheat, timber, minerals, and manufactured goods, fueling the economy and helping settlements grow. Passenger trains were a common sight, carrying people from rural towns to urban centers for work, shopping, or special occasions. However, train travel was not always affordable for everyone. First-class cabins were luxurious, catering to the wealthy with elegant dining cars and comfortable sleeping compartments, while economy-class passengers had to endure long, crowded journeys with few amenities. Despite their importance, railroads had limitations. Train travel was often slow, subject to delays caused by harsh Canadian winters, and vulnerable to strikes or labor disputes. Many remote communities still lacked proper railway connections, making it difficult for residents to access essential goods and services. The rise of the automobile. While railroads continued to dominate long-distance travel, the automobile was quickly becoming the new symbol of modern transportation. By 1924, cars were no longer just a luxury for the wealthy, they were starting to become more accessible to the growing middle class. The Ford Model T, introduced in 1908, had revolutionized car manufacturing with its assembly line production, making automobiles cheaper and more widely available. In cities, cars were beginning to change the way people lived. Streets that had once been filled with horse-drawn carriages and bicycles were now increasingly crowded with automobiles. Gas stations, repair shops, and paved roads were becoming more common, though road infrastructure was still in its early stages. Many streets were unpaved, dusty in the summer and muddy in the spring, making driving a challenge, especially in rural areas. For rural Canadians, owning a car was still a luxury, and many continued to rely on horse-drawn wagons or sleighs in the winter. However, those who could afford automobiles found that they greatly improved mobility, allowing farmers to transport their goods to market faster and making travel between towns easier. Despite the excitement surrounding cars, there were challenges. Traffic laws were still developing, and road safety was a serious issue. Speed limits were inconsistent, and accidents were common due to poorly maintained roads and inexperienced drivers. Many cities were struggling to adapt to the growing number of vehicles, with streetcars, pedestrians, and automobiles competing for space on the roads. Streetcars and public transit. In major urban centers like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, streetcars were the primary mode of public transportation. These electric trolleys ran on tracks through city streets, providing a reliable way for people to commute to work, visit shops, and travel around town. Streetcars were affordable, making them popular among the working class, and they played a significant role in shaping urban development as neighborhoods expanded along streetcar lines. However, streetcars had their drawbacks. They were often overcrowded, and during rush hours, passengers were crammed into tight spaces. In winter, maintaining streetcar lines was difficult, as snow and ice frequently disrupted service. Despite these challenges, public transit was essential for those who could not afford automobiles, and cities continued to expand their streetcar networks. The beginnings of aviation. One of the most exciting developments in transportation in 1924 was the rise of aviation. While air travel was still in its infancy, it was quickly capturing the imagination of Canadians. The First World War had demonstrated the potential of airplanes, and many former military pilots were now exploring commercial aviation. In 1924, the Royal Canadian Air Force, RCAF, was officially established, marking the beginning of Canada's modern Air Force. Though initially small, it played a crucial role in mapping remote areas, assisting with search and rescue operations, and even experimenting with air mail delivery. Civilian aviation was also taking off. Early bush pilots were beginning to fly into Canada's northern and remote regions, delivering mail, supplies, and medical aid to communities that were otherwise difficult to reach. These daring pilots navigated vast wilderness areas with little more than a compass and an open cockpit, facing extreme weather conditions and mechanical failures with no easy way to call for help. Although commercial passenger flights were still rare and expensive, they offered a glimpse into the future of travel. People began to dream of a time when airplanes would connect cities and make long-distance travel faster and more convenient. Challenges of infrastructure. Despite the advancements in transportation, Canada's infrastructure was still developing. Many roads were little more than dirt paths, making travel difficult in bad weather. Bridges, tunnels, and highways were limited, and many rural areas had no direct access to reliable transportation. Even in cities, traffic congestion was becoming an issue, as planners struggled to accommodate the growing number of vehicles. Telephone lines and electrical grids were expanding, but much of rural Canada still lacked access to these modern conveniences. Communication and transportation often went hand in hand, with mail delivery and newspapers remaining the primary sources of information for most Canadians. A nation on the move. By 1924, transportation in Canada was at a crossroads. Railroads still played a vital role in connecting the country, but automobiles were beginning to reshape everyday life. Streetcars provided reliable urban transit, while aviation was opening new frontiers. These changes reflected the broader transformation of Canadian society, as technology and innovation paved the way for a more connected and mobile nation. Life in Canada in 1924 was shaped by tradition, hard work, and a growing sense of modernity. While many aspects of daily life remained simple compared to today, the 1920s were a time of social and cultural change. Cities were growing, new technologies were emerging, and people were beginning to experience shifts in fashion, entertainment, and lifestyle. However, the strict social norms of the past still dictated much of everyday life, especially when it came to gender roles, class distinctions, and moral expectations. Home and family life. For most Canadians, home and family were the center of daily life. Whether living in a rural farmhouse, a small-town cottage, or a city apartment, family structures were largely traditional. The nuclear family, consisting of a husband, wife, and children, was the most common household arrangement. Extended families often lived nearby or even in the same home, particularly in rural areas, where extra hands were needed for farming or household work. The role of women in the home was well defined. They were expected to be caretakers, managing household chores, cooking, sewing, and raising children. Running a household in 1924 was labor-intensive. In many areas, electricity and running water were still unavailable, meaning chores like cooking and laundry required hours of manual labor. Washing clothes was a multi-step process involving scrubbing on a washboard, boiling water on a wood stove, and hanging clothes to dry. Cooking was equally demanding, with most meals being made from scratch, often using homegrown ingredients. For men, the expectation was to be the primary breadwinner, working outside the home in agriculture, industry, or business. Their responsibilities included maintaining the home's finances, making major decisions, and ensuring their family's survival in a time when financial instability was common. Children were expected to contribute to household chores, and in rural communities, they often worked alongside their parents on farms. School attendance was becoming more common, but many children left school early, some as young as 12 or 13, to help support their families. In cities, boys might take on apprenticeships or factory jobs, while girls often worked in domestic service or as shop assistants. Fashion and social expectations. The way people dressed in 1924 reflected both tradition and a growing sense of modernity. For women, the 1920s were a revolutionary time in fashion. The flapper style, with its short skirts, bobbed hair, and loose-fitting dresses, was a bold departure from the restrictive corsets and long gowns of previous decades. However, while young women in cities embraced this trend, many in smaller towns and rural areas still adhered to more conservative styles, wearing long skirts, high collars, and modest blouses. Men's fashion remained relatively unchanged, with suits, hats, and ties being the standard attire for those in cities and professional jobs. Working-class men, particularly those in farming or labor-intensive jobs, wore durable clothing such as overalls, suspenders, and sturdy boots. Hats were essential for both men and women, whether it was a fedora, flat cap, or cloche hat. Social expectations were strict, especially regarding behavior, etiquette, and relationships. Courtship was a formal affair, often supervised by family members. Dating in the modern sense was not common. Young men and women typically met through social gatherings, church events, or family connections, and marriages were often based on practical considerations rather than romance. Divorce was rare and heavily stigmatized, with marriage seen as a lifelong commitment. Work and leisure. Work dominated much of daily life, but people still found ways to enjoy their free time. Entertainment in 1924 was simpler but growing in popularity, thanks to the rise of radio, film, and organized sports. Radio was becoming an essential part of the home, bringing news, music, and entertainment to Canadians across the country. Families would gather around the radio in the evenings to listen to news broadcasts, music programs, or serialized dramas. Silent films were the height of entertainment, with movie theaters showing popular stars like Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks. Theaters were packed with audiences eager to escape into the glamour of Hollywood, even if only for a short while. Sports were a major pastime, with ice hockey, baseball, and lacrosse being among the most popular. Hockey was particularly beloved, with the National Hockey League, NHL, gaining popularity across Canada. Small-town teams played on frozen ponds and makeshift rinks, while cities hosted professional games that drew large crowds. Dances, community gatherings, and church socials were also central to entertainment, particularly in small towns. Music was a major part of social life, with jazz gaining popularity and dance halls attracting young people eager to embrace the lively spirit of the Roaring Twenties. Moral standards and changing attitudes. Although the 1920s are often associated with the rebellious spirit of the Jazz Age, Canada remained largely conservative in many aspects of daily life. Religious institutions played a dominant role in shaping morality, and social behavior was heavily regulated by community standards. Drinking alcohol was a controversial issue. Prohibition had been in place in many provinces, but by 1924, it was gradually being lifted, allowing for the legal sale of alcohol under strict government regulations. Women had made significant strides in gaining rights, having won the right to vote federally in 1918 and in most provinces by the early 1920s, but they were still expected to conform to traditional roles. While some women were entering the workforce, they faced significant discrimination and were often paid far less than men for the same jobs. Attitudes toward different social groups were also shaped by racial and ethnic prejudices. Indigenous Canadians, Black Canadians, and immigrants from Asia and Eastern Europe faced systemic discrimination, with limited job opportunities, segregated schools, and social exclusion being common. Many communities had unspoken, and sometimes legally enforced, policies that restricted non-white residents from living in certain neighborhoods or participating fully in public life. Despite these rigid social structures, change was on the horizon. The younger generation was beginning to challenge old norms, embracing new music, fashion, and social freedoms. Women were pushing for greater independence, labor unions were demanding better working conditions, and immigrants were carving out their place in Canadian society. The tensions between tradition and modernity were shaping the way people lived, worked, and interacted with the world around them. In 1924, education in Canada was a system in transition. While attending school was becoming more common for children, especially in urban areas, the quality of education varied widely depending on where a child lived, their social class, and, in many cases, their cultural background. Schools were seen as the foundation for building a strong nation, but resources were limited, and not all children had equal access to education. The structure of education in 1924. Education in Canada was largely controlled at the provincial level, meaning that the school experience varied depending on the region. However, the general structure of schooling followed a pattern. Elementary school typically lasted from ages 6 to 14. Children were taught basic subjects such as reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography. High school education was still a privilege rather than a necessity. Many children, especially in rural areas, did not attend high school as they were expected to start working at a young age. Those who did continue their education were often from middle or upper-class families who could afford to support their children beyond the mandatory schooling years. University and college education was even more exclusive, reserved for a small percentage of the population. Higher education was primarily for those pursuing careers in law, medicine, engineering, or theology, and women were only beginning to be accepted in universities. The school experience. For many children, attending school in 1924 was a rigid and disciplined experience. Classrooms were often small, with one teacher responsible for teaching multiple grades in the same room. Schools were typically one-room buildings in rural areas, with wooden desks, blackboards, and a simple potbelly stove for heating in the winter. Students sat in rows, and strict discipline was enforced by the teacher. The teaching methods focused heavily on rote memorization and strict repetition. Children were expected to recite lessons aloud, copy from textbooks, and memorize historical facts, arithmetic tables, and grammar rules. Creativity and critical thinking were not emphasized, and questioning authority was discouraged. Teachers had strict authority over students, and corporal punishment was common. A misbehaving child might receive a ruler across the knuckles, be sent to stand in the corner, or, in more severe cases, be struck with a cane or strap. The emphasis on discipline reflected broader societal values. Children were expected to be obedient, respectful, and hardworking. School supplies were limited. Notebooks, pencils, and chalk were sometimes scarce, and children often had to share materials. In poorer areas, families struggled to afford even the most basic school supplies, and many students had to reuse old books passed down from older siblings. Challenges in rural education. In rural areas, getting an education was often more difficult than in cities. Many children had to travel long distances to reach their schoolhouses, walking several kilometers in all kinds of weather. During the harsh winter months, heavy snow and freezing temperatures made attendance nearly impossible for some students. In farming communities, education often took a backseat to work. During planting and harvest seasons, many children were pulled out of school to help their families with farm labor. This meant that rural students often had inconsistent schooling, making it harder for them to advance academically. Teachers in rural schools were often young women who had received only minimal training. The job of a rural teacher was challenging, as they were responsible for teaching multiple age groups with very few resources. They were expected to maintain discipline, teach every subject, and often lived in the same community where they worked, making them a central figure in small-town life. Urban schools and emerging educational reforms. In cities, schools were larger and more organized, with dedicated classrooms for different grade levels. Urban students had better access to resources, such as libraries, science labs, and extracurricular activities. However, even in cities, educational opportunities were still limited for poorer families, as children from working-class backgrounds were often expected to leave school early to find jobs. The 1920s were a time of educational reform as governments began recognizing the importance of literacy and basic education for all citizens. Provincial leaders pushed for higher attendance rates and began investing in teacher training programs. Educational policies were slowly shifting toward making high school more accessible, though it would still take years before secondary education became the standard for most Canadians. Education for girls and women. While girls attended school alongside boys in elementary grades, their educational opportunities were often more limited beyond that point. High schools often had separate programs for girls, focusing on domestic skills like sewing, cooking, and childcare, rather than academics or professional training. The expectation was that most women would become housewives, so subjects like mathematics and science were often deprioritized for female students. However, some women were beginning to challenge these norms. A small but growing number of women were pursuing higher education, particularly in fields like teaching and nursing. Universities were slowly opening their doors to female students, though many still faced discrimination and were discouraged from entering male-dominated professions. Education and Indigenous communities. One of the darkest aspects of Canadian education in 1924 was the existence of residential schools. These schools were designed to assimilate Indigenous children into European Canadian culture, often forcibly removing them from their families and placing them in government and church-run institutions. At residential schools, Indigenous children were forbidden from speaking their native languages or practicing their traditional customs. The education they received was poor, often focusing more on labor skills than academics, and many suffered from neglect, malnutrition, and physical abuse. The goal of these schools was not to educate, but to erase Indigenous identity, and their harmful impact on Indigenous communities would last for generations. While public schools in cities and towns were expanding, Indigenous children were largely excluded from the same educational opportunities as non-Indigenous Canadians. The residential school system represented a profound injustice, one that was still ongoing in 1924 and would continue for decades. The future of education. Although education in 1924 was still deeply flawed, particularly in terms of accessibility, gender roles, and racial discrimination, it was slowly evolving. The idea that education was essential for the nation's progress was becoming more widely accepted. Efforts were being made to expand literacy, improve teacher training, and increase school attendance, setting the foundation for the more structured and inclusive education system that Canada would develop in the years to come. By 1924, Canada was experiencing rapid advancements in transportation and communication, transforming how people traveled, interacted, and accessed information. The country, vast in size and diverse in geography, was becoming increasingly connected through railways, automobiles, telephones, and radio broadcasts. While modern conveniences were still limited to urban centers and wealthier households, technological progress was beginning to reach even the most remote communities. Railways, the backbone of Canadian travel. The railway system was the lifeline of Canada in 1924. Trains were the primary mode of long-distance transportation, carrying passengers, goods, and mail across the country. The Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR, and the Canadian National Railway, CNR, dominated the landscape, connecting cities and towns from the Atlantic to the Pacific. For many Canadians, train travel was the only viable option for moving long distances. Roads were still undeveloped in rural areas, and automobiles were not yet common for most families. The railway system allowed farmers to ship their crops to markets, manufacturers to transport goods, and people to visit relatives or seek new job opportunities in different provinces. However, train travel was not always comfortable or accessible. First-class passengers enjoyed private compartments, cushioned seats, and dining cars, while working-class travelers had to make do with crowded, noisy, and sometimes unsanitary conditions in lower-class cars. Despite these challenges, trains remained essential for both personal and commercial travel. In addition to passenger transport, railways played a major role in immigration, bringing new settlers to the prairies and expanding industries in growing cities. Western Canada, in particular, relied on rail transport to move wheat, cattle, and timber to the rest of the country and overseas markets. Automobiles, the rise of the car era. While railways dominated long-distance travel, automobiles were beginning to revolutionize personal transportation. By 1924, cars were no longer a luxury reserved solely for the ultra-wealthy. Middle-class Canadians were slowly starting to afford vehicles, thanks to mass production and the influence of companies like Ford and General Motors. The Ford Model T, introduced in the early 20th century, remained one of the most popular cars, offering a relatively affordable option for families and businesses. However, driving in the 1920s was far from easy. Roads were largely unpaved, especially outside of major cities, making travel difficult and unreliable. Rain and snow would turn dirt roads into muddy, impassable routes, while winter conditions made driving nearly impossible in some areas. Streetlights and traffic signals were rare, leading to chaotic and often dangerous conditions in busy city streets. Gasoline stations were not yet widespread, and in many parts of the country, drivers had to purchase fuel from hardware stores or general shops. Mechanics were few and far between, so car owners often had to fix their vehicles themselves. Additionally, driver's licenses were not required in most provinces, meaning that roads were filled with inexperienced and sometimes reckless drivers. Despite these challenges, the automobile was changing Canadian life. Farmers and small-town residents who once relied solely on horses or trains were now able to travel independently. Cities saw a rise in car ownership, leading to the development of paved roads, traffic laws, and automobile-related businesses such as repair shops and gas stations. The freedom of car travel was a new and exciting prospect for many Canadians, setting the stage for the car-dependent culture that would emerge in the decades to follow. Urban transportation, streetcars, and buses. In larger cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, streetcars were the primary mode of public transit. Electric streetcars ran on tracks through city streets, providing an efficient and relatively affordable way for workers to commute and for residents to move around. However, streetcars were often overcrowded, especially during rush hours, with people cramming into cars as they traveled to factories, offices, and markets. Despite this, they were a necessary part of daily life, as few people could afford private automobiles. Buses were also beginning to make an appearance in some cities, offering an alternative to streetcars and trains. Though not yet as widespread, they provided greater flexibility, as they were not restricted to fixed tracks. The telephone, changing the way people connected. The telephone was one of the most transformative inventions of the early 20th century, and by 1924, it was becoming a common feature in businesses and wealthier homes. Telephone lines were expanding across the country, making it easier for Canadians to communicate without having to send letters or travel long distances. However, not everyone had access to a telephone. Rural areas still lacked widespread phone service, and many small towns had only one or two shared phone lines for an entire community. Those who did have home telephones often used party lines, where multiple households shared a single connection. This meant that conversations were not private, as neighbors could listen in on each other's calls. Despite these limitations, the telephone was revolutionizing communication. Businesses could place orders faster, families could stay in touch more easily, and news could spread more quickly. The speed of communication was increasing, setting the stage for the more connected world that was to come. The radio, a new era of information and entertainment. Perhaps the most exciting technological advancement of the time was the rise of radio. By 1924, radio was becoming a household staple, providing news, entertainment, and music to Canadians across the country. Families would gather around their radios in the evenings, listening to broadcasts that ranged from news reports and political speeches to live music performances and radio dramas. Before radio, people relied on newspapers for information, but radio allowed them to hear events as they happened. This created a sense of national unity, as Canadians from different provinces could tune in to the same broadcasts and experience major events together. However, radio technology was still in its early stages. Stations were limited, and reception was often poor, especially in rural areas. Many homes needed large antenna setups to get a clear signal, and static interference was a constant issue. Despite these technical challenges, radio was rapidly growing in popularity, with more Canadians purchasing radio sets and tuning in daily. The impact of radio went beyond just entertainment. It was a powerful tool for shaping public opinion. Politicians, businesses, and social leaders quickly realized its potential for spreading ideas, advertising products, and influencing national discussions. The power of radio would only grow in the coming years, eventually becoming one of the most dominant forms of mass communication. The future of transportation and communication. By 1924, Canada was at the cusp of a major transportation and communication revolution. Trains still ruled long-distance travel, but automobiles were starting to make their mark. Streetcars and buses were keeping cities connected, while telephones and radios were changing the way people received information and stayed in touch. These advancements laid the foundation for the modern world. The idea of fast travel and instant communication was no longer just a dream. It was becoming a reality. With each passing year, new inventions and improvements would continue to shape Canada's future, bringing people closer together and making the vast nation feel just a little bit smaller. By 1924, Canadian society was experiencing a cultural transformation, influenced by both tradition and modernity. The post-World War I era had brought about a newfound enthusiasm for life, and people were eager to enjoy themselves. While work and daily responsibilities occupied much of their time, leisure and entertainment were becoming an essential part of life. The emergence of new forms of entertainment, such as radio broadcasts, silent films, and jazz music, alongside traditional pastimes like social gatherings and sports, shaped the way Canadians spent their free time. Music and dance. The Jazz Age arrives. The 1920s are often remembered as the Jazz Age, and by 1924, this exciting and controversial new music genre had firmly taken hold in Canada. Jazz, born in the United States, quickly spread across North America, bringing with it a lively and rebellious energy. Young people, particularly in cities, were drawn to its upbeat rhythms and improvisational style. Dance halls and nightclubs became popular venues where people could gather to hear live bands perform. The Charleston, the Foxtrot, and the Lindy Hop were all the rage, and young men and women flocked to dance floors to show off their moves. The growing popularity of jazz reflected a broader shift in social attitudes, one that embraced fun, self-expression, and breaking away from the stricter moral codes of previous generations. However, not everyone approved of jazz. Many older and more conservative Canadians viewed it as wild and inappropriate, believing that it encouraged reckless behavior. Despite this, jazz continued to thrive, influencing Canadian musicians and shaping the future of the country's music industry. The rise of radio, a new way to experience entertainment. By 1924, radio was revolutionizing the way Canadians experienced entertainment and information. Families would gather around their radios in the evening, listening to live music performances, comedy programs, and news broadcasts. Unlike newspapers, which required people to read and interpret events for themselves, radio provided a shared experience, allowing people across the country to hear the same news and entertainment at the same time. This helped to create a sense of national identity, as listeners in different provinces felt more connected through the stories and programs they heard. Canadian radio stations, though still relatively new, were beginning to establish themselves. Some of the earliest broadcasts included live music, sporting events, and political speeches. As more households purchased radio sets, advertisers saw the potential for radio commercials, marking the early days of commercial broadcasting. Movies and the magic of silent films. One of the most exciting forms of entertainment in 1924 was going to the movies. Silent films were a major attraction, drawing large crowds to theaters in both big cities and small towns. Without synchronized sound, these movies relied on expressive acting, title cards, and live musical accompaniments played by pianists or small orchestras in the theater. Hollywood was already becoming the dominant force in filmmaking, and Canadian audiences flocked to see stars like Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Mary Pickford. Pickford, who was born in Toronto, was particularly beloved, known as America's sweetheart, despite her Canadian roots. Movie theaters, or picture palaces, were grand and elaborately decorated, creating an atmosphere of glamour and escapism. Attending a film screening was more than just watching a movie. It was an event, often accompanied by live performances or newsreels that gave audiences a glimpse of current events. However, movies were not universally accepted. Religious groups and moral conservatives often criticized films, fearing that they promoted immorality, loose behavior, and unrealistic expectations. Despite these objections, the film industry continued to grow, and by the end of the decade, talkies, movies with synchronized sound, would revolutionize cinema. Sports, a growing national passion. Sports were an integral part of Canadian social life in 1924. While hockey was already a national obsession, other sports like baseball, football, and lacrosse were also widely enjoyed. Hockey, the National Hockey League (NHL), was still in its early years, having been established in 1917. Teams like the Toronto St. Patricks, later the Maple Leafs, and the Montreal Canadiens were building their legacies. Hockey was more than just a sport. It was a cultural institution, with communities rallying behind their local teams. Baseball. Though not as dominant as hockey, baseball had a strong following. Amateur leagues thrived, and Canadian cities had their own professional and semi-professional teams. Many Canadians also followed Major League Baseball in the United States. Football. Canadian football was growing in popularity, with leagues forming in different provinces. The Grey Cup, awarded to the best football team in the country, was already a prestigious championship. Lacrosse. Often referred to as Canada's national sport, lacrosse had deep roots in Indigenous communities and continued to be played across the country. Beyond professional sports, recreational activities like ice skating, skiing, canoeing, and hiking were popular among everyday Canadians. These outdoor pastimes reflected the country's deep connection to nature and the changing seasons. Social gatherings and community events. For many Canadians, socializing was a central part of entertainment. People gathered at churches, community halls, and private homes to enjoy music, storytelling, and dancing. Church socials, barn dances, and tea parties were common ways for people to connect, especially in rural areas where entertainment options were more limited. In urban areas, nightclubs, speakeasies, and theaters were the hot spots of entertainment, where people dressed in their finest attire for a night out. These venues were particularly popular among young adults eager to embrace the changing social norms of the 1920s. Holiday celebrations and parades also played a major role in entertainment. Events like Canada Day, Victoria Day, and Christmas festivities were eagerly anticipated, often featuring public gatherings, fireworks, and performances. Books, magazines, and newspapers, the power of print media. While radio and cinema were emerging as dominant forms of entertainment, print media remained a major part of everyday life. Newspapers were the primary source of news, with major publications like the Globe, the Toronto Star, and the Montreal Gazette keeping Canadians informed about politics, business, and world events. Magazines also gained popularity, offering a mix of literature, fashion, and advice columns. Women's magazines, in particular, provided guidance on domestic life, beauty trends, and etiquette, reflecting the era's expectations of women. For those who preferred books, libraries and bookshops were popular gathering places. Classic literature, adventure novels, and romantic stories were widely read, and many Canadians still enjoyed the works of authors like Charles Dickens, Mark Twain, and Lucy Maud Montgomery, whose *Anne of Green Gables* had already become a beloved novel. The changing role of women in entertainment and social life. The 1920s marked a period of newfound freedom for women, and this was reflected in entertainment and social activities. Flappers, young women who embraced short skirts, bobbed hair, and a more independent lifestyle, became a symbol of change. They were seen dancing in jazz clubs, smoking in public, and openly challenging traditional gender roles. Women also began to take on greater roles in sports, literature, and theater, although they still faced significant barriers in many areas. While some viewed these changes as exciting progress, others saw them as signs of declining morals, leading to ongoing debates about women's roles in society. A society in transition. By 1924, Canada was undergoing a cultural shift, with entertainment playing a crucial role in shaping society. The traditional ways of socializing and celebrating remained strong, but new forms of entertainment, like jazz, radio, and cinema, were reshaping how people experienced joy and leisure. As technology continued to advance and social attitudes evolved, Canadians were beginning to embrace a more modern and exciting way of life. In 1924, Canada was in a period of transition, both politically and economically. The country was still recovering from the effects of World War I, grappling with social and labor unrest, and defining its role on the global stage. At the same time, it was experiencing economic growth in key industries, new political movements, and an evolving relationship with Britain and the United States. While the 1920s are often remembered as a decade of prosperity, Canada's path was not without challenges. Politics in 1924, leadership and shifting power. At the helm of the Canadian government in 1924 was Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, leader of the Liberal Party. His leadership marked a shift from the more militaristic and imperialist policies of his predecessor, Robert Borden, who had guided Canada through World War I. Mackenzie King was known for his pragmatic and cautious approach to politics, preferring compromise over confrontation. He sought to strengthen Canada's autonomy from Britain while maintaining a cooperative relationship with the British Empire. At the same time, he was focused on stabilizing the economy, dealing with labor strikes, and navigating the complex post-war period. Opposing the Liberals was the Conservative Party, which was still rebuilding after the wartime years. They criticized Mackenzie King for not taking a stronger stance on national issues, particularly in regard to foreign affairs and economic policy. However, the biggest political challenge of the time wasn't from the Conservatives. It came from the growing influence of new political movements, particularly in the Western provinces. Regional discontent and the rise of new political movements. While the Liberal and Conservative parties dominated national politics, a growing divide between rural and urban Canada was becoming more apparent. Many Western provinces, particularly Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, felt that the federal government was neglecting their needs in favor of the industrialized eastern provinces like Ontario and Quebec. This frustration gave rise to the Progressive Party, which emerged as a powerful political force in the 1920s. Representing farmers and rural communities, the Progressives demanded lower tariffs, better transportation infrastructure, and fairer economic policies for agricultural workers. They saw Ottawa as too focused on supporting big businesses and the banking sector, while Western farmers struggled with fluctuating wheat prices and transportation costs. The Progressives' rise signaled a shift in Canadian politics, with regional concerns gaining more prominence. While they never formed a federal government, their presence in Parliament forced the major parties to pay closer attention to Western interests. Canada's economic boom, industrial growth, and trade. The mid-1920s were a period of economic expansion in Canada. The country was experiencing a post-war boom, fueled by natural resource industries, manufacturing, and trade. Major sectors driving the economy included wheat and agriculture. The prairie provinces were known as the breadbasket of the world, exporting wheat and other crops to global markets. Improved farming techniques and new machinery were increasing yields, but farmers were still vulnerable to unstable crop prices. Mining and forestry. Canada's vast natural resources played a crucial role in the economy. Gold, silver, nickel, and copper mining were expanding, particularly in Ontario and British Columbia. The forestry industry was also thriving, with timber exports increasing. Manufacturing. The rise of automobiles, railways, and consumer goods created a surge in industrial production. Factories in cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Hamilton were producing everything from steel and textiles to appliances and automobiles. Hydroelectric power. Canada was rapidly developing its hydroelectric industry, supplying power to factories and homes. Provinces like Ontario and Quebec were investing heavily in dams and power stations. However, this economic growth wasn't shared equally. While industrial workers and business owners in urban centers benefited from rising wages and job opportunities, farmers and rural laborers struggled with fluctuating prices and mounting debts. Labor unrest. Workers demand better conditions. Despite economic growth, Canada faced significant labor unrest in the early 1920s. Workers in factories, mines, and railroads were often subjected to long hours, low wages, and poor working conditions. Labor unions were gaining strength, leading to a series of strikes and protests across the country. One of the most famous labor conflicts of the decade had taken place a few years earlier, the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919, where over 30,000 workers had walked off the job demanding better wages and fair treatment. By 1924, tensions between workers and employers remained high, with strikes occurring in industries such as mining, textiles, and transportation. The federal government and business leaders often took a hard stance against unions, fearing that labor movements were becoming too radical. Many Canadian politicians viewed socialism and communism as threats, particularly after the Russian Revolution of 1917. In response, some labor leaders were labeled as agitators, and crackdowns on strikes were common. Despite resistance, the labor movement paved the way for future workplace reforms, including better wages, reduced working hours, and improved safety standards. Canada's relationship with Britain and the world. In 1924, Canada was still officially a dominion of the British Empire, meaning that Britain controlled its foreign policy. However, the country was increasingly asserting its independence on the world stage. One of the most significant developments of this era was Canada's growing economic and political relationship with the United States. Trade between the two countries was expanding, and American culture was becoming more influential in Canadian society. Many Canadians viewed the U.S. as a rising global power and recognized the benefits of closer economic ties. At the same time, there was a push for greater autonomy from Britain. Mackenzie King and other Canadian leaders wanted Canada to have more control over its foreign affairs rather than automatically following Britain's lead. This shift in thinking would eventually lead to the Statute of Westminster in 1931, which gave Canada full legal independence in matters of foreign policy. Despite these changes, Canada still had strong ties to Britain. Many Canadians remained loyal to the British monarchy, and British influence was deeply embedded in Canadian society, from government structures to cultural traditions. Challenges on the horizon. While Canada was experiencing economic growth and political transformation, challenges remained. Income inequality, regional divides, labor unrest, and dependence on resource exports made the economy vulnerable to global shifts. Just a few years later, in 1929, the Great Depression would bring economic collapse, unemployment, and widespread hardship, undoing much of the progress made during the 1920s. Politically, Canada was at a crossroads. The old system of two-party rule was being challenged by new political movements, and the country was inching toward greater independence from Britain. The decisions made in the 1920s would shape Canada's future, influencing its role in global affairs, economic policies, and social progress. As the decade continued, Canada would experience both prosperity and hardship, navigating the complexities of a changing world while forging its own national identity.